There's so much, I don't know, fear, so much possibility, so much just latent potential. I think when we're in those transition moments of letting go of someone, like we've been talking about here, is like in the spiritual sense, but in any area of life, letting go of an identity, letting go of a career path in order to move towards something new. It's a crazy, wild thing. And wanting to highlight those kind of transitional moments and hear how people thought about those, navigated those, and lessons along the way.
Podcast Junkies, episode 313. Welcome back. I'm your host, Harry Duran. Newcomers to the show, thank you so much for finding it, for discovering it. This is the one where we search out interesting voices in podcasting and get them to kick back their heels, talk about their shows and whatever else is on their mind. If you are a regular listener, then I appreciate the work that you're doing to help support this show, keep the show going. It's been a labor of love since 2014. I can't believe that next year will be the 10-year anniversary of this show. It's pretty wild to think about. I've had so many fascinating conversations. It's opened up so many doors. It's led to me starting my agency. It's led to me starting a second show, the Vertical Farming Podcast, which some of you may or may not know about, which I do every week as well. If I really stop to think about it, I don't even know if I can imagine what my life would be like without podcasting. I was clearly on the 9-to-5 hamster wheel, and for better or for worse, got pushed out of my last job, and it sort of forced me to take that entrepreneurial jump, which started with this show, which led to my agency. And I can't imagine what would happen if I hadn't taken that leap. My goal when I started was to do a weekly show, and that's waxed and waned over the years. Some months have been more challenging than others. And to think about it, it's a lot of work to put a podcast together, as anyone who is a podcaster themselves knows. But there's definitely joy and happiness that I feel when I look at these scheduled conversations on my calendar, some new faces, some old friends. And I know that with a focus on curiosity, a focus on learning more about these folks and digging deeper to have meaningful conversations, I always end up having a good time. I always feel better after these conversations. So if you've ever been on the fence, if you don't even have a podcast and you've been enjoying the podcasting medium and thinking about starting your own show, I'm so adamant that it's important to find your voice. And your first episode is not going to sound that good. You're not going to like the sound of your own voice, but your 10th sounds better than your first. Your 50th sounds better than your 10th. Your 100th better than your 50th. And your 300th better than your 100th. Maybe I'll let you be the judge of that. So just pausing here to take a look back at all the work that's being done, and really excited about a renewed focus on quality conversations. I've got a couple coming up with a longtime listener, Timothy Kim O'Brien, Kate Chericello, who I was introduced to, and JJ Flazanes. 3 great conversations, and respectively, each of them for a different reason. And I can't wait to share those with you. If you are loving this show, I'd love it if you leave a rating and review, if you have not done so already, at ratethispodcast.com/podcast junkies. We're overdue for some reviews, folks, so I'd love to read yours out on a future episode. If you have been following the Podcasting 2.0 space, I'm happy to report that our podcast host, Captivate.fm, now supports Podcasting 2.0 and Value for Value. If you don't know what that is, I highly suggest you check out valueforvalue.info, and that's the number 4, so value, the number 4, value.info to learn more. What's been fascinating to watch in terms of the work Adam Curry and Dave Jones are doing is that there are now 4 million creators indexed, which is the podcast index themselves, and 12,696 shows now have value enabled on their show. So it's going to be a long time before it crosses the threshold of something that people talk about on a regular basis. But if you want to support your creators and you are a podcaster yourself and want to have that one-to-one connection with your listeners, I highly encourage you to check it out. Value for Value, the number 4, valueforvalue.info. Okay, before we get into this uninterrupted conversation with Dan, here are a few words from the folks that support this show. And as a reminder, if you are looking to partner with a podcast whose super niche focus is on folks in the podcasting space and the services that are of value to them, reach out, harry@podcastjunkies.com. This episode is brought to you by Focusrite, and specifically the Scarlett 2i2 sound card, one of my favorite go-to sound cards, something I use for each and every podcast recording. The 3G line is a go-to for all new podcasters. Find out more at podcastjunkies.com/focusright, and the link will be in the show notes as well. Dan Cumberland, host of The Meaning Movement. Thank you for joining me on Podcast Junkies.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm just so excited to be here with you.
You've got some really great mood lighting going on. I'm trying to do some theater of the mind stuff for our listeners. At some point, we do record video, and I have a long to-do list of getting the video onto YouTube this year. So I've got to paint the picture for listeners for now.
Well, we've decided to take the podcast to YouTube, and I was like, well, we're going to do it. We need to do it all the way. I still haven't fully embraced my identity as a YouTuber. That still feels really it feels clunky. We're still, I think, very much audio first, but want to at least look better.
So how's that experience been moving to YouTube, and what have been some of the bumps along the way?
Yeah, I mean, it's just added layer of complication. The major change is just in how you edit, moving from just using audio processor, workstation to something that does both. We moved it to Descript as our primary editor for that, which works well. And I think there's so many things that I feel like I want to change to really be able to say that I'm a YouTuber, I will record my intros, usually kind of batch my intros separate from the interview. Mm-hmm. And so then the lighting's different because I have windows in my office, and I'm usually wearing a different shirt or whatever. And I've been fine with that. Clearly I got a haircut between the two times I record, I'm fine with that. But I'm also it probably would be smoother to have a different, So I feel like you kind of just have to take it one step at a time. You just kind of keep iterating and keep improving.
I think what's interesting, and this is what I find fascinating about this show, because it's as meta as it can get. It's a podcast where I interview other podcasters. But I think it's been helpful for a peek behind the curtain, because I launched in 2014, and I just wanted to hear about, in the beginning, maybe their setup and what they talked about and what their experience was with guests. But over time, I'm always looking forward to something going wrong within the conversation, because I'm going to leave it in.
Just as a talking point, just as a point of this is how things break.
It's true. No, this is the real world of podcasters. When a dog jumps into the guest's lap, I'm wait, gotta know what's the dog's name? Because they're trying to keep the dog at bay during the conversation. Shh. And I'm no, this is we've seen the videos of folks throwing a blanket over their head or recording an audio in a closet. And I think it's helpful. And especially during the pandemic, we're not all NPR. We couldn't get to a studio, so everyone was kind of make do with what they could do at home. And I think it's just a wake-up call, and also encouraging for other folks getting started. So I'm just that to say that, showing all the warts sometimes is fun.
I agree. And I think the longer I've been in business, the more comfortable I've been in just saying, I don't have it all together. I'm kind of a hot mess. And and I feel maybe it feels hopefully entrepreneurship culture is kind of moving that way towards build in public and just share your lessons along the way, and for better and worse. And so I'm a big fan.
I think this idea of build in public is really picking up steam, which I love a lot. There's some projects that I've been working on the no code side, and I was doing build in public stuff. Even the setup, if you do the comparison of your beautifully lit background and my no of having light behind you, light box effect with a half a curtain drawn. I'm just whatever.
It works though. It works. It's I mean, at the end of the day, if it's an engaging conversation with, that's what matters the most. And the rest is just icing on the cake.
I always like to roll out the welcome mat to the listener, because I always feel I want to make them feel comfortable and not feel we're talking to them or down to them, or we're better than, it's just we're in a bar. And they just pulled up a stool and just listened to us have this conversation.
I love that. That's something that has stood out to me as I was listening, just kind of getting into the mindset to jump on with you. I love how you talk to the listeners and how you kind of connect the dots between shows and past shows. I feel very much ushered into the episode. So
I got a chance to listen to a little bit of the conversation with Alex Sanfilippo, who's a friend of mine as well.
Yeah.
And he's always engaging. He's nonstop. I don't know if you've ever seen him in person, but he's at the conferences and he's just I got to go meet this guy, and then I got to have a meeting with this guy.
I believe it. This guy. I've not met him in person, but I could totally see that in him. He's just
coming from his background of where he worked and stuff like that, it's been fun to see that energy. And then you've had Ronsley on, Dr. Melvin Varghese.
Yeah, I've gotten pretty close with, he and I chat a lot about LinkedIn. We're both doing a lot on LinkedIn together. And so we're messaging a couple times a week back and forth. So it's been really fun to listen into to that conversation with you.
So I'm a huge fan of origin stories. I'm curious when podcasting came on your radar.
Oh man, yeah, this is great. Podcast. So it was kind of a two-pronged approach to podcasting. First, and this is very much a part of my whole journey, I started the Meaning Movement as a way to help people broadly figure out what to do with their lives. More recently, that's really been, nuanced further into helping entrepreneurs, build businesses that we then love, find fulfillment and purpose, in the journey. I had no idea how to start a business though. I knew I wanted to reach everyone. I wanted to reach the world. So I started a blog and I have no idea about blogging. And
what year is this?
This was, I started 2012, 2013. Yeah. So 2012, 2013, kind of that fall between those 2 years when I first bought the domain, got this, figured out how to do WordPress, which was so confusing when you've never been in there before. And then did an internship with a team that was doing SEO, and it was just a way to just learn from what they were doing. They had this way to bring interns in, you'd build a site with them, and they were trying to build these niche sites, which was big things at the time. Yeah. But then this might be getting into the weeds. It was right when Google had introduced a sandbox period, right after I started. So the new sites couldn't rank within the first 6 months or something like that. And so they were like, well, for what we're going to do, we're going to look at other ways to get traffic. Why don't you start a podcast? And I was like, great, I'll start a podcast. I had no idea how to do that. And so I was doing that for that project. It was called Startup with Kids. It's now long defunct. And shortly thereafter, so I did that for a few episodes, and then we kind of wrapped up that internship. And then I was trying to figure out what to do next with the Meaning Movement, and put in a question to Pat Flynn on his One Day Business Breakthrough, this podcast that's also now long defunct. It was one of the first episodes, and he played the audio, and then basically people ask a question, then he responds to it. And he was like, man, this guy has just such great energy. You've got to start a podcast. And he gave me a bunch of other stuff, but I'm like, well, if Pat Flynn tells you what to do, you can't not do it.
Pat made me do it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I can kind of say that. And I've been dying to have a chance to tell him that, someday. That'll be when
post it on Twitter or something like that.
Just of my story.
Yeah.
But yeah, so then I started, it was probably, by the time I actually started, it was 2015 sometime or so, sometime in there. Yeah. My oldest son is 7, and I think we were just expecting him, I think, when I first started. Yeah. So yeah, that's how I date the podcast.
Why the topic of meaning? Why is that important for you?
Yeah. Oh man. I mean, the simple version is I've struggled with that my whole life. And I mean, I could say, literally my whole life. I could tell you the story all the way going back to my, family of origin, and feeling like I, didn't really fit the mold in some ways with my family. My mom's an accountant. My dad's an engineer. My brother now is a computer programmer. And, and I'm a creative. I'm an artist, right? It's very analytical minds. And then there's me, who is kind of all over the place. But then moving forward with that is through college and post-college, really struggled, had a really hard experience right after college, was in ministry, was a youth pastor for a few years.
Yeah, I saw that.
I mean, both really great in some ways, great student community. I love mentoring and, helping people become, who they're made to be, but also just a square peg in a round hole. And so then coming out of that, basically felt like my whole life kind of unraveled on me, because I thought that was what I was supposed to do. It was my calling with a capital C. And so then to question that is to question everything. And that led me to grad school, following the one thread that I felt like I could follow, which was meaning and purpose. I don't know what to do with my life, but I know that this piece matters to me. So I'm going to follow that and see where it takes me. So I did an interdisciplinary degree around theology, psychology, culture, and formation. And through that program, again, was just kind of felt this confirmation, I just get juiced up about these conversations and want to have more of them, want to figure out some way to do something with them. And so then, and that's, I guess through that also, it was kind of a process of me owning the fact that I think I just like starting things, and that's okay. And I like to have lots of irons in the fire, and like to have projects going on, just how I am in the world. And that's okay. If not okay, but also good. And so then coming out of grad school, thinking about where do I put this thing, this energy around these ideas? So then it was well, let's build a blog. Let's try to reach more people. A lot of the people that I knew going through that program, a lot of people are going into therapy and things like that, doing a lot of one-on-one work. And I want to go bigger. I want to reach more people. And so the blog, then podcasting, a one-to-many kind of avenue just felt right in those ways.
Do you feel that looking back at those experiences and seeing where you are now and where you're headed, has it changed this idea of having a calling into a new perspective where it's almost like you still have the calling, but it's different than what you thought it was back then?
Yeah. Oh man, that is such a good question. In a lot of ways, like how I think about this, especially that word calling has changed a lot less emphasis on the capital C calling and more on like, how I would define it today is that people are made to do something, right? We're made to be ourselves. And when words like vocation, words like calling are ways to talk about the actualization of that or putting that into the realm of work or using our agency, our ability to create change, right, in a meaningful way that's in alignment with who we are. And so that's some of how I've really thought about it, how I think about it now. When I kind of first started down this path, it was a lot of kind of like stripping back. And I honestly don't even use the word calling that often in my work because it has so much baggage. And I think especially for people that have like a religious background, faith background, it can take on like a lot of weight that like God told you to do this thing and you must do it regardless. And that's where I was, right? Yeah, like it doesn't matter that it doesn't feel good. You have to go do it, right? And I think that's really the opposite of what I believe at this moment in time, what it really means to live into a calling. It's to live into yourself and live into, the space that feels good and feels at home in the world.
Yeah, it's this idea of being comfortable in your own skin.
Well said.
And also being comfortable sharing your journey and also your relationship to, things that fall on a wide spectrum when it comes to religion and spirituality and woo and however we want to address those. I mean, I grew up Catholic and so even was confirmed and baptized and all that sort of stuff. And then went away from that and now came back at it from a spiritual perspective. Yes. And so that's been almost like a 25 journey for me since I discovered Buddhism and then just went, New Age gets into far down the rabbit hole. Yes, which most of my friends are people that have seen me online now. I'm curious for you how your relationship with your faith or just trust in the universe or whatever you want to call it, how that's shifted over time, where it stands now.
That's a great question. I love that. I'm kind of moved by that question. I cry a lot. So just if this goes that way, then just know that I'm comfortable with that. I think I'm really moved by that question because it feels really good in this context and really surprising in this context. Like I didn't expect this conversation to go that way. And it's really fun. I think that it's gone from questioning everything and saying like, a lot of anger at God and the idea of God, but still like a lot of grasping to like want to hold on to something. And like I grew up Christian and very evangelical, very, often very conservative, not like ultra conservative Christian. And so then there was a lot of like, okay, there's a lot of things that I don't want to return to, right? But I want to hold on to something. And for a long time, I kind of just set those questions aside and didn't really want to engage with them at all. And then it feels like over the last few years, I think really kind of coinciding with having kids. My oldest, have 3 kids, 7, 4, and 2. Having kids makes you think about the world differently. And it's like, what is the story that I want them to hear about reality, And so then those questions need to matter more. At least that's how I've felt with it. And so it's kind of brought me back full circle in some ways. And I've taken a lot of cues, made a lot of peace with, I think, this part of the journey from Krista Tippett from On Being and how she talks about herself as being Baptist, even though maybe not in the very classical sense. And that's, I think, really following her examples kind of like led me to feel like, okay, I still call myself Christian, but I hold that very loosely and I hold everything. I hold all of it, in a much, much looser hand. So maybe even just to use that metaphor, it felt like I kind of set everything down and then maybe picked something back up, but I'm not holding on to anything that tightly as much as, if my parents listen to this, they might be freaking out a little bit right now. But yeah, that's how I think about it at this moment.
Yeah, it's helpful to have that context. And thank you for sharing that. And thank you for being open and vulnerable. I think we need more of that because, we sort of alluded to it earlier, this facade that we put forward of this is my life is perfect and I have everything figured out and a clear relationship with, whatever's out there, whatever you want to call it. And I have all the answers figured out. And I think it seems to tie in closely with this idea of finding meaning and which leads to the podcast, but also the meaning in life. And then as a parent, how you let your kids almost come to those conclusions on their own, because our generations, we were spoon fed, this is what,
this is it.
It is it. This is all there is until that one day when you see outside or beyond the curtain, you're like, oh, no, that's not all there is.
Yeah.
And you're like, my perspective of what I thought life in order was, it gets a little shaken up. And I think this idea of giving, your kids agency over their own choices and their ability to make their own decisions, and teaching them those skills sooner rather than later, I think is very important.
Yeah, thank you. And it is challenging too, because like the way I just answered that question is like, it's muddy, right? Like it's not black and white. And yet kids' minds like aren't necessarily able to hold the complexity, and they're not able to hold, dualities and things like that. And so even to like give answers when they ask a question and also acknowledge that there's more to it than that, felt like that's some of what the work has been so far. But I feel like what I have to do is invite them on a journey, like to say that this is going to be your own journey. Like, here's what we believe, here's how we think about it. And also like, you're going to have to, find your way. So, and hopefully I'll be there to help.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me know if you have any questions.
Yeah. I'm going back to scrolling my phone.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, especially coming from a religious background, when you go through those moments of, what some people call dark night of the soul, or, whatever, it's like the valleys. Mm-hmm. Not having like something to grasp onto, or even someone to curse out when you're like, why am I here? Like, it's interesting to have that relationship and come to, my perspective. What I believe is I'm a soul who made a decision, conscious decision to incarnate here to create and experience what it's like to be a human being. So rather than, the idea of human beings have a spiritual experience, I consider myself a spiritual being having a human experience.
Oh, that's fascinating. I love that. That takes me to all kinds of places. I'm going to have to think about that one. Yeah.
So, I love painting that perspective and just kind of where you were in your life, and then this idea of starting the show. Yeah. How did you think about who you wanted to bring on the show and what types of conversations you wanted to have? And, and how deep were you prepared to go in the beginning with these guests?
Oh, man. And this is like an ever evolving question. Like we're about to wrap up this current season of the show, and the show's been through a transition over the last 6 months and will continue to transition. And like, that's a big question, is like, okay, when we approach our next season, I'm taking a little bit of a break, but like, again, it feels like we're always kind of just tearing it down and then rebuilding. But broadly, the show started with just wanting to hear just the twists and turns of career stories. Broadly, the question like, how did you get into that? And, what are all the journeys that, the twists and turns, the choices that you made, the surprises along the way, and to hear like, especially the transitions. And I think I've always been just really curious about transitions, because there's so much, fear, so much possibility, so much just latent potential. I think when we're in those transition moments of letting go of somewhat, like we've been talking about here, is like in the spiritual sense, but in any area of life, letting go of an identity, letting go of a career path in order to move towards something new. It's a crazy, wild thing. And wanting to highlight those kind of transitional moments and hear how people thought about those, navigated those, and lessons along the way. And so that's kind of been some of the guiding question that I've tried to have, the conversation I've tried to have with folks over the years.
How do you decide who to invite onto the show?
There's so many ways. Ideally, it's like, this person's interesting and I'd like to hear more, from them. Sometimes it's also just been like, getting recommendations from listeners, from guests. We did an experiment, which I feel like was kind of a failed experiment. You can't call it a failed experiment. It was an experiment. The thesis proved to be invalid. How about that? The hypothesis proved to be invalid. So if that's a failed experiment, that's a failed experiment. But in the fall, going with a show of like, let's just say yes to a lot of guests, but then have different criteria for them. I just launched Video Snap. And so I was like, well, what if we do, in order for someone to come on the show, we ask them to jump through some hoops to be on the show. So then we broaden our definition of who we're bringing on the show, knowing that like, I think I can have a pretty productive conversation with a lot of different people. But in order to do that, they need to do a promotion of Video Snap or of something else related to, to the meaning movement. It didn't work at all, because like the people that weren't at all bought into like what I was doing. And so the people that did do something were like, it was so half-hearted that it was like, I got a click. We got one click from all of that. And so, but then moving forward, what we're really thinking about, and some of the transition over the last year has been going from, okay, this is a show about fulfillment and meaning and how people have navigated those questions in career, to really thinking about like applying those same questions, but to entrepreneurs and how we're building businesses and how are we thinking about fulfillment and success in our businesses, which has been very purposeful in helping us find a more clear demographic that we're trying to reach, a listener that we're trying to speak to. And I know this is like business 101, but it's just taken me 7 years to get here. And that's just been my journey. So now that we have more of a clear demographic, and I say we because I've also brought on a co-host, Raj Lula. He's done a co-hosted episodes with me, but moving forward, he'll be a much more frequent co-host. And he and I have been strategizing around all of this a lot, but thinking through, it's not about, just having interviews and, making those interviews productive, but like, what's the journey that we want to take our listener on? And what is the best way to accomplish that journey? So what's the best way to meet the needs of the listener? And then working backwards from that to format. And then also, how do guests do guests even fit into that format, which will be ultimately more of like topical conversations and less of like broad, far-reaching interviews. Yeah. So that's kind of some of the many iterations over the years.
Yeah, and I think it's a reminder to the listener that there's no one path. And I like the fact that you brought up the hypothesis that didn't work. I'm a big fan of failing forward, getting up quick and figuring out what didn't work. And it's that entrepreneurial mindset that you have that you didn't realize it's a skill set you need to learn when you get started, because the first failure is like, oh, I suck at entrepreneurship. I got to go back to getting a real job. And you realize, oh, no, this is part of the journey.
Yes.
To keep going through that. How have you grown as a host in starting the show?
I remember the very first episode, it was like, this is what the show is going to be about for that Startup with Kids podcast. So that one that, that predated the meaning movement. I was like so amped up, and it like, I should try to see if I can find that file anywhere, because I was like, just totally like on just adrenaline pumping through my veins. I was like, just recording this. I'm going to publish it, and people are going to, so much. And I'm already like kind of a fast talker and a little bit like anxious. And I think in a positive way, but like I know I bring a lot of energy to conversations. I've gotten a lot more grounded in my how I show up, a lot more confidence, in less anxiety in like, where's the show going to go? Much less attached to like specific questions or having a roadmap, and I think just better at like asking the good question and listening. And I know I've heard you talk about this with some of your guests, like just how important it is to like listen for the questions that you might miss otherwise, and how you never do it perfectly, but like, when just something emerges and it's like, yeah, that's the direction we need to go next. And so I think just listening to the guests and then like listening to myself in the conversation, I think I've gotten a lot better at that, which is just a long, fancy way of saying I think I've gotten better at interviewing.
How much prep are you doing now for guests?
Not as much, though. In our next iteration, probably a lot more. And what that will probably look like is like a planning call with each guest of some sort. Even if it's just like, we're going to talk for 10 or 15 minutes to kind of structure things before, like, but I think because like the conversations, we're going to want to dig into people's, burnout stories or, like specific things that are intimate. And like, I think that those will take a little bit more of a lift. But beyond that, if it's someone who has a body of work, a book or a podcast or, other things, YouTube channel, whatever, will try to take in as much as I have time for so that I can have a more educated interview. But beyond that, not a ton. I'm not like, digging into the archives of people's GPAs and
trying to come up with some obscure reference to a childhood friend that's higher.
I wish. I mean, that would be really fun.
Yeah, Susie from third grade says hi. Like she's still tragically sad over that breakup.
Yeah, exactly. Like your mom's hairdresser told me that when you were a kid.
I've heard that. I think Tim Ferriss used something like that.
Oh man, that's good.
Talk a little bit about the decision to bring on a co-host, because it's interesting. When you get started, you feel like this is going to be your show and it's your baby and it's something you're going to live with forever. And I'm curious about the decision-making process or the thought process for how you think about something like that.
Yeah. Oh man, it has been a journey. So I first started talking with Raj about the meaning movement and had been on the show years ago. He's a story brand guide, a partner of a marketing and strategy, branding agency. And so he thinks in these terms a lot. And so we'd kept up and kind of rekindled a friendship this past year. And kind of out of some of that was just having a lot of conversations about what the project is about, what the meaning is about, really trying to figure out how to grow in a lot of ways. And like, my work with the meaning movement is just one piece of the things that I do. And this is even coming back to like the conversation around fulfillment and meaning, but it's like something I'm so passionate about. And also like, it has never been my primary income stream. It's been a piece of the business portfolio. And I really always wanted it like more from it in that way and wanted to be able to justify giving it more time and attention, just haven't been able to get it there. And so we're talking a lot about that and helping to kind of identify some of the problems, I don't have a really clear avatar or target listener, demographic. So clarifying some of that, then thinking through what does it look like to approach that question differently and create content differently. And also, so even just some of his feedback, sometimes the show just sounds kind of lonely. It's just, kind of you a lot. And I'm like, it is. And it really does feel lonely.
That's an interesting description of it. Or to
yeah.
use.
I was surprised to hear that, even though that is my felt experience. But I just figured that's just the life, the life of the podcaster. You're behind the mic and you don't know what else is happening. But I think through that, just began to imagine okay, maybe it doesn't have to be like that. And how else could this look? So which started as co-host Raj and I having a series of build in public kind of style episodes about the project and about how I'm thinking about, meaning and fulfillment and next, transitions with the podcast itself, which then has led to let's just keep doing this and kind of see where it goes. So yeah, so that's some of the, it's just a work in progress, but that's a very slow progression. It hasn't been oh yeah, let's do a co-host now.
Yeah, once you start working with someone else, it's their whole experience, different personalities, the connection that you had with your guest. You're, probably worried, do you lose some of that magic? Do you gain new magic? Is it some alchemy that's the sum is greater than the individual parts? And then it's a lot of unknowns, but I guess to your point, you don't know until you actually try. So it'd be interesting.
And even more recently, I've been coming into this year, kind of reached this point of I'm just spread really thin and kind of need to make some adjustments. I'm not sure what's next with the podcast. And then Raj was just saying, what if in the next iteration of the podcast, you're not on all the episodes? And I was like, whoa. Just kind of this reframing, what you said about being a soul in a bot. It's whoa, I've never flipped it that far. This is
mind
the world
blown,
feels a little upside down right now. But also yeah, that kind of is healthy. This thing is, I hope the meaning movement, what I'm building here is bigger than just me. It's not just Dan's personal brand. And I think that could be really healthy. And so I expect that we'll have some of that in the future. But yeah, that's kind of a surprising reframe of content.
I noticed in your LinkedIn that you had a couple of posts recently about this idea of having ADHD and how that's not necessarily a bad thing. And I resonate with that because shout out to my therapist who's been helpful for me in my personal journey and my journey with my partner as well. And just this awareness of things you don't see about yourself and things that you think sometimes are a detriment, but actually it's just the way you're wired. This concept of neurodivergence is fascinating for me. Oh yeah, I get it. Okay, now. So that explains a lot of my previous behaviors. And so can you talk about what your experience and has been, going down that path and your journey
exploring that? Yes. Yeah. It has been really liberating to have language to talk about I was gonna say all my problems. It's just how I am in the world.
Yeah.
We need to reframe this. It's not necessarily problems. And again, Raj has been a great inspiration in this direction as well. Also, when it comes to my kids, thinking through, some of them have some they're young, but also whether or not they end up on that spectrum, I'm not that concerned, but just to think I see some of the struggles that they have with things like time. I've always struggled with time. And, a lot of neurodivergent people, you have now and then you have then. There's nothing in between. And so then pacing is really hard. And that just resonates so much with me. And also you see it's reflected back to you so much in your kids because it's just so much more raw and they haven't developed the executive function that I've developed, even though I feel I still have so many gaps. And it's just been really helpful to have more language, to have more stories, to hear other people's experiences, and to feel the parts of me that don't make sense have a way of making sense, I think is the best way that I can say it. When you look at it with that lens, it's all those things that I've struggled with that you tell yourself, make up all kinds of other stories about now there's a story that I can tell, at least in myself. And I don't I try not to use it as a, I screwed up there because I'm, blah, blah, blah. I take responsibility for my action. But at the same time, I can see okay, and I see how that is a result of, that I struggle in these ways. And therefore, I need to bring some more support around myself to help, do better in the future.
Yeah, it's helpful. And I think the more we have these discussions out in the open, I think it's going to be helpful for people to feel comfortable, especially with an older generation, I think, where there was a stigma attached to it. Or an embarrassment, or just not understanding what was happening, and just acting in certain ways that you couldn't really explain. And so having language around that and being able to like talk through it has been extremely helpful for me. And the more I see people talking about it, it was the post of one of my weekly newsletters that goes out every Saturday. I was like, hey, talking about ADHD, it's not a bad thing. And it's just like something that's more and more common. So that's what I applaud you for talking about it as well.
Yeah, I mean, and I think at its best, it's a superpower. Like, we can get stuff done. When you're obsessed about whatever it is, it's like crazy what can happen. And there's so many other ways. I feel like that's some of also like a bit of a connector. And like, I always love like bringing people together, and I'm all so good at building communities and like all these things. Even coming full circle here, like, you know, the youth ministry that I led was like an incredible space where all those kids that were a part of it, they each will tell you that how special that was. And I think like a part of it is just because of the way my brain works, as weird as that is. And so all that's to say, there's so many other ways that having a neurodivergent way of being in the world makes things special. It makes things challenging, but also brings a lot of magic.
Yeah, I agree. So I want to talk a little bit about Video Snap, but prior to that, I want to talk about, I guess, your visual arts journey, because you were a photographer for quite a bit as well. So can you talk about, you know, let's talk about that path of your
that
journey.
Piece? Yes, yeah. Photography's been with me for a long time, since I was a kid. And in college, you know, this is very much date myself, but like DSLRs, digital cameras, are just like had just come out. It was like very cool technology. So I bought one, and then all of a sudden, like, you know, film is free, and just accelerated. Like, people today, you know, who are grown up in the world of digital cameras, like, you just take for granted how fast feedback is. You take a picture and you can immediately see the result, and two, like, just how much cheaper it is, because you can, you know, click that shutter as many times as you want, and you're not having to pay, you know, 25 cents a click or whatever it is. So yeah, so started in college, you know, doing some photography, and then kind of did on the side through when I was in youth ministry, and then in grad school, and after, as I was starting the Meaning Movement and really kind of trying to, actualize my desires to be an entrepreneur, started a photography company with my wife. So we were doing lots of portraits, weddings, that iterated into still a lot of portraits, but a lot of corporate and business stuff, a lot of, you know, headshots and business lifestyle. It's so funny, like, you asking me this question even today. This probably is the first time I've actually talked about it on a podcast interview, because it's like, I've tried not to be a photographer professionally for a long time, but it's like one of those things that, like, yeah, like, the business comes, like, we'll still take it. And literally even just yesterday, did a shoot with this client we've had for like, 6 years. And it's like so easy, and the money is good, but it's also like, that's not like, my life is no longer optimized for this. And so my wife and I are always like, okay, like, we're only making, you know, we're only doing like 10 or 20, you know, shoots a year or whatever. It's not that much. And we probably just need to just say, like, that's money, but that's not the good money, you know? And that's kind of where we are, you know, right now with it. But for a long time, it was the staple, you know, the kind of the financial foundation of our household. While we were building other things, as you know, building the Meaning Movement, my wife was building, she was an educator, she was building a piano studio at the time of students, and then we were doing photography. So that's some of my story.
Yeah, that's great. My partner's a photographer as well. She's been doing it for over 10 years, and she recently stopped doing weddings.
Yes.
She had done over 300, but now she focuses more on like branding and storytelling, which is really lights her up a bit more. So I
super
definitely
fun stuff.
Understand. Yeah. So talk about the origin story for Video Snap.
Yeah. So Video Snap, it's a bit of a scratch your own itch problem. And I'd love to get your thoughts on how you've thought about solving this problem. But trying to solve the problem of discoverability for podcasts, at least an additional way to solve that problem. You're recording these long form interviews and podcasts, and knowing that growth is slow and hard. And like we've already talked about, there's other factors to that. Like, I've probably not defined my target audience as well as I could have, and all these other things. But wanting to just like get that good content out in front of more people, and the format just makes it really hard for that. Audio, you know, doesn't necessarily do well on social. Everyone's on social, on the social channels. And so the first thing that we did was start recording video, then cutting out segments and making shorts, and saw that the platforms were all moving towards shorts with the rise of TikTok, YouTube shorts more recently, you know, Reels, stories, et cetera, et cetera. Everything is moving towards video shorts. And so I had on my team a woman who was doing content for me. She would go through transcripts, pull out sections, go back to my editor. The editor would, you know, give her those cuts. She would approve them. He would put captions on them. She would have to, you know, correct the captions because the grammar was, you know, well, all the things and back and forth and back and forth. And so after, we were doing that for a while and seeing like lots of impressions. And I think that's, it's hard to draw a straight line from any piece of social content back to, a new listener. But what I can look at is how many people are watching those videos on social.
Yeah.
And by just consistently showing up on social, consistently putting content out there, not all of it gets engaged with, but it gets watched. And you see those play counts, that people are on the other side of that. And so seeing those results and wanting to figure out how can we streamline this, both for myself and for other people. I haven't talked that much, I guess, about my software journey that has been in parallel with the meaning movement, but I've been in the software world for about the last 7 years or so. And both running a video platform that was held by a private equity firm and then launching a couple softwares. So I knew a lot about building product, partnered with a development team, 923.co, to build VideoSnap as a way to take what my team was doing, simplify it, and even improve it, make it better. And so that's kind of the origin story of it. The way the platform works is you upload a long form piece that can be either audio or video. So your long form piece of content, the software then transcribes it for you. You go in, you just select the text of the section that you want to make into a short, click one button, and the software breaks it into moments, puts text over video. If it's a video source, it'll start with that video, but then it'll cut to other B-roll footage that's sourced based on the conversation that's happening. So it's looking for keywords, looking for ideas, and then finding stock footage to match to make a very cool and engaging text over video style video that's more engaging than just a person talking. It's a person talking, then you're seeing other things that kind of fill out the story. And it does it all in just a few clicks in just a few minutes. You can go from your source file to something ready to go on social.
And I've seen some of these similar type services. Is it important that the host select the piece, or is there an option also for like your team to like find?
Yeah, that's a great question. So right now, the person using the software does select the section. And the reason being is we've played with other ways of doing it and played with those other tools and have always had disappointing results. We are playing with like a done for you service, but that would kind of be its own kind of separate thing. So we're, have our team that would just, if you're interested in the software, interested in what we're doing, but you don't want to spend the time doing anything with it, send us your footage and we'll do your shorts for you.
What's that journey been like as an entrepreneur, software developer, on top of all the different types of hats you're wearing? Right. I think people listening or watching might have questions about like, how much time in the day? And maybe this ties back into the ADHD conversation.
Oh, that totally ties back into the ADHD conversation. And I think that's one part of it is like, I have a little bit of entrepreneurial HD. And that's, I mentioned kind of going into this year that I felt like I was spread really thin. And that's been a kind of circling back to this idea of like, okay, what am I saying yes to? What am I saying no to? How am I defining success for myself so I don't end up burned out? Because I have that tendency because I love all these things. They're so cool. And I want them all to exist. And so that's a discipline that I've had to develop is saying no. But yeah, just to speak to some of that, some of it is like I have this trifecta of work, the meaning movement, building VideoSnap, and then doing product work with 923. And of those, like right now, 923 is the primary income, and the other two are, VideoSnap is right now we're reinvesting everything back into the platform, back into building it. We're early. We only have 50 something users, slowly growing that, but it takes time. And the meaning movement, I'm reinvesting a lot of what I make there. And the only monetization method, the only thing that I'm doing there as far as, I guess there's some like affiliate links from my site. I'm not even going to count those though. But I have an accelerator all around, helping entrepreneurs align their personal goals and their business goals. And so like some of the struggle of like having, a lot of passion, a lot of dreams, a lot of ideas is that like you can't build them all. And even especially when you have something that you're super passionate about, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to make enough money as quickly as you want it to in order for it to be your main thing. That's been some of the journey with the meaning movement of like, I've been at this for like 10 years and it's, there's been moments when it's been like, yeah, I'm going to focus on this right now. And then it's always come back like, okay, I'm not there, or it's not there, or we're not there together. So yeah, but I think, it's a matter of like finding the synergy between them. And that's how I'm thinking about it a lot these days is that like, I'm the same person in all of these things. I think they do play together well. The way that I think about entrepreneurship and fulfillment and purpose and all these things with the meaning movement plays into how I think about product and how I come along founders that are building software and helping them think about how they're building their businesses. So they really do, at their best, they play together. Like they're like kids, they either play together, they're best friends, or they're kind of worst enemies.
Yeah. So if we're having this conversation 12 months from now, what does success look like?
Oh man, that is so good. Success looks like balance. I mean, there's some literal, like very tangible, like for me, like one of my goals is to get my family to a bigger house. We have 3 kids in a small house. Yeah. So like, that's one way that I'm thinking, like it's success in the next 12 months. That's one way I'm thinking about it. But even bigger than that is quality of life, like having some more time with my kids, having enough time with my kids. I've been setting an intention every morning, like thinking through each of my kids and how can I love them better. And like, I know that might sound very simple, maybe especially to non-parents out there, but like it's really challenging, especially when like you're going one way, your kids are going another way, like unless you're intentional about it, you only have these like quick moments. And how are you going to use those moments to help your kid know that they're loved and that you're in their corner? And so like, that's the primary way that I'm thinking about success is 12 months from now, if I can say that I'm loving my kids well. And I mean, all of it comes back to that, right? Because I was going to say, I'm not stressed out about business, but like, I don't think I can be stressed out about business and love my kids well. Because when I'm stressed, it bleeds over and I'm not kind, I'm not patient, like the anxiety that I have in one area of life bleeds over into how I interact with them. And so that's a primary category for me.
No, I just like the fact that you mentioned intentions and affirmations as a guidepost, for figuring out where you want to go and where you want to be. It's something that's been incredibly helpful and a critical part of my days when I have the time to do them or I remember to do them. But I notice that, I try to follow my meditation with intentions and affirmations. And I feel like I sense that those days feel like I get more done or I'm just charged up more.
Yeah. When I think like just to have that, your thoughts, I really believe your thoughts create your reality. And so if I'm creating a reality in which a primary objective is to love my kids better, like there's no way that could be bad. But yeah, I'm a big believer in it.
Yeah. A couple of questions as we get close to wrapping up here. What's something you've changed your mind about recently?
That's such a good question. Something I've been rethinking. I can't necessarily even say I've changed my mind, but yeah, maybe. I don't know. I've been in college. I made the decision to be a vegetarian. And like at this point in my life, I mean, that was a long time ago. I'm 40, just turned 40 this last year. So it's been a long time. And I'm not changing and that's partly ethical, partly environmental, partly, health oriented. But as I've learned more about like factory farming, industrialization of farming, and like a part of it also is like with the kids, like it's easy to have like a black and white, like, yeah, we don't eat meat. And thinking about like, is that always the best choice for all the people involved in the food supply chain? This is probably getting deep into these things. But I mean, I could say honestly, if the choice is between industrial grown vegetables and humanely, regeneratively organic raised meat, like that's actually the better choice. So I guess it's kind of, again, bringing up this idea of like the gray areas and not the black and whites. But that's something that's kind of changing my thought process about it, changing how I talk about it with my kids to say that we eat plant-based instead of saying we're vegetarians, like we eat plant-based. It's a change. And yeah, that's what comes to mind.
It's interesting because my partner and I, for the most part, are pescatarian, but we've recently incorporated some meat that's actually from a company called Maui Nui, based out of Hawaii.
Okay.
And so it's interesting because there's an overpopulation of there on that island.
Yeah, I've heard of this.
Yeah, yes. Created a system, and we're talking 40, 50,000 deer. And so they've got a plan to cull down the population, but they use sharpshooters. So it's one shot kill. Yeah. So throughout the life of the deer, they're never stressed.
Yes.
And not even at the point, they're not aware that they've just been like, lived a good life and they dress the animals on site. So from a freshness perspective, you get a subscription box and there's different cuts. And, we've been having that for a couple of months now. And I'm telling you, like, I grew up eating meat and you just have a piece of that and you're like, whoa, it's just like amazing.
Yes.
And you feel good about what the company's doing. So it's in alignment with what you were talking about.
I love it. It's a great example. I feel like I need to instead of just saying, let's just throw all that out and it's as simple as a convenient choice, but convenient just does not necessarily mean it's the right choice. And so that's kind of where I'm rethinking.
And meat should be expensive. I think we've grown up in a world of 99-cent hamburgers and we think like that's normal.
Absolutely.
It probably should not be that way.
Absolutely. I've just been reading. So there are 2 resources related to this. One is the Carbon Almanac, which is a book that Seth Godin organized, and I'm a volunteer with the Carbon Almanac Network, which is all about, having more conversation and helping people see the actions that we can take around sustainability. That's been just seeing the subsidies around industrial agriculture, particularly around meat, is astounding. And then I've also been just listening to Yvonne, what's his name? Schweinert from Patagonia, the founder of Patagonia, his book, Let My People Go Surfing from 2015 or so. And it's just an incredible book all about the values that he's built his company around. But he's talking about farming in one section in that and saying that like if without subsidies, if there were no subsidies at all to any farming, an organic farm would be like organic food would be cheaper than the food that we eat currently. That's, GMO and industrialized, which is just crazy to me. And like, this is never like put it in those terms, like how responsible the government is for the problems in the food supply chain.
Yeah, agreed. Last question. What is the most misunderstood thing about you?
Man, these are such good questions. I knew you'd have some good ones for me today. Misunderstood thing about me. There's so many different directions I go with this, but the place I go with it is I have a very hard time feeling like the people in my life that I know in real life, not online, understand who I am, because I feel like I can have a conversation with someone like you. I feel like you get it. Like you get the journey, you get the struggle, you get like all those pieces. And it's really hard to feel like my friends, the people that I spend time with outside of my office, get this. And I'm curious if you have a similar experience, or I'm curious how other people maybe similarly, like, is the solution because, just find more people like you to hang out with in real life? Or I think that's it. It's opening. I'm new to the Minneapolis area where I live. I didn't grow up here. My partner's from here, so none of my friends are here. And I moved here in late 2019, so I went through 2 years of the George Floyd riots and COVID. And so just now discovering like this city. And so getting out of my comfort zone. My comfort zone, I think I'm a situational extrovert. I like to go to podcast conferences and I'll be the life of the party. But like once that's over, I'm like back in my shell. And, and I think I'm coming to grips with that as I get older, and thought I was more extroverted, but it's just really situational. So, but just finding the people who understand the entrepreneurial journey, who can relate to it. And so I attended like a nice in-person mastermind like a week ago, 2 weeks ago. And I was just like, oh, cool. There's people I can actually shake hands with, not just on the other side of a screen, that are going through this as well. So I think to your point, it's helpful to get out of our own bubble sometimes and push ourselves out of that comfort zone to make those connections. Yeah, I love it. It's great hearing your journey with it. And man, what a crazy time to arrive in Minneapolis, with what a journey you've been on. Yeah, it's been interesting. So hopefully we can swap places and then I'll give you the whole story. I'd love it. Sounds great. Some good fodder for the podcast. Yeah. So thanks for reaching out. And I know sometimes I don't do as good of a job of like seeing what's out there in the world. There's so many podcasts and so many podcasters. You can't really tell sometimes just by seeing a face. So I appreciate and thank you for making that connection. I'm really honored to have you share your story. I think we've covered all the bases, I think. Oh man, faith, this is photography, entrepreneurship. Awesome. We've done it all. We've done it all. And I appreciate you being vulnerable and sharing your story. I think it's going to help a lot of folks. So, thanks again. And I'm looking forward to having folks connect with you. So what's the best place for them to do that? I love it. Well, first, I just want to say, thank you so much for just asking such good questions. It's been such a fun conversation. And for folks that are interested in VideoSnap, and what I'm doing there, just go to videosnap.io. Wherever you're listening to this, you can check out my podcast, The Meaning Movement. I've been writing a lot on LinkedIn, as you mentioned, about burnout, neurodivergence, ADHD, a lot about pacing, balance, and the entrepreneurial journey. So would be happy to connect with people there. And if there's anyone thinking about software, building stuff, I'd love to build some stuff with you. So that's at 923.co. We'll make sure all those links are in the show notes as well, so folks don't have to go track them down. Thanks again for your time, Dan. I really appreciate it. I love it. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks again to Dan for coming on the show and sharing his story, being vulnerable, and allowing us to connect on a personal level, which is what I'm looking for in these conversations. Life's too short to not connect on a more meaningful level, and that's what I'm looking for with each one of these conversations, each one of these interviews. Intro and outro music composed by Cedar and Soil. Learn more at cedarsoil.com. Don't forget, we write full show notes, summaries, timestamps, takeaways from these episode, resources mentioned. You can find all of that at podcastjunkies.com. Don't forget to check out our sponsor, Focusrite, and their awesome line of gear, specifically the Vocaster lineup. You can learn more at podcastjunkies.com/Vocaster. Podcast production and marketing provided by Fullcast. Learn more at fullcast.co. As mentioned at the top of the show, tune in next week for my conversation with Timothy Kino O'Brien, longtime fan of the show. Great conversation. I know you're going to love that one as well. And if you've made it this far, you're no doubt looking for this week's retention hashtag. Let's go with hashtag meaningdan.
in support of his Meaning Movement podcast. Tag us at podcast_junkies and Dan at Dan Cumberland, all one word. Thanks for all you do to support this show. Talk to you next week.